Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Sean Mixon. I am the director of the Reasonable Faith Dallas chapter, a ministry founded by William Lane Craig. I'm also the Thought Decoder with the Thought Decoder page and website and uh, different avenues, different resources for you so that you can kind of learn some critical thinking tools, learn some logic, if you will, and see how it's used in practice. So that's what I like to do here. It's an educational platform. Thanks for tuning in. So we've been taking a look at Jordan Peterson's work here lately. He did uh, a Bible lecture, and he looks at the Bible a little differently. And I want to see what merits do Christians have with his approach. What can we gain from his approach? What is useful for us as believers? Are there any assumptions? Are there any approaches or principles that he has in his approach to the Bible that are at odds with Christianity? We want to just take a look at it because most people kind of hear Jordan Peterson talk, and most Christians are sympathetic to him because he's an evolutionary psychologist, but he's not like a lot of these evolutionary psychologists who are dismissive of religion as having no type of merit. And he even mentions this in his lecture. So we've been going through his lecture, breaking it down. We want to pick up on it. So right now he starts his lecture off by talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a philosopher who's famous for saying that God is dead. Jordan Peterson interprets Nietzsche as saying that this inspirational creative spirit that led to science is in danger of being killed. This creative piece, and it's this scientific mind that is about to kill God. So he thought that the Catholic Church gave birth to science, and that science and turned around and destroyed its mother from whom it came. Uh, the church. And so he interprets Nietzsche as making this point. He brings in Carl Jung as saying that people have this dreamlike state that they're not fully conscious of, and it's in this dreamlike state over millions of years that human beings have thinking that has the dreamlike state is the place where thinking arises from, and over millions of years this thinking and consciousness has arrived from this state. And so he looks at the Bible as having encoding, as it were, this dreamlike state, this primitive uh, instinct of human beings, and he tries to see what he can learn about the human being as such uh, from reading the Bible. At least that's what I've gathered so far. So we're going to pick up today where we left off and see what we can learn from it.
And the relationship between that and art. I know this native carver, he's a Kwakwaka'wakw guy. He's carved a bunch of wooden sculptures, totem poles, and masks that I have in my house. And he's a very interesting person, not literate, not particularly literate, and really still steeped in this ancient 13,000-year-old tradition. He's an original language speaker. And the fact that he isn't literate has sort of left him with the mind of someone who's pre-literate. And pre-literate people aren't stupid, they're just not literate. So their brains are organized differently in many ways. And I've asked him about his intuition for his carvings. And he's told me that he dreams, like you've seen the Haida masks, you know what they look like. Well, his people are closely related to the Haida, so it's the same kind of style. He said he dreams in those animals and can remember his dreams. And he also talks to his grandparents who taught him how to carve in his dreams. Quite often, if he runs into a problem with carving, his grandparents will come and he'll talk to them. But he sees the creatures that he's going to carve living in an animated sense in his imagination. And I mean, it's not that difficult. First of all, I have no reason to disbelieve him. He's a very, very straightforward person, and he doesn't have the motivation or the guile, I would say, in some sense, to invent a story like that. There's just no reason he would possibly do it. I don't think he's told that many people about it. He thinks it's kind of crazy, you know. He said when he was a kid, he thought he was insane because he'd had those dreams all the time about these creatures and so forth. And so it wasn't something he was trumpeting. But I found it fascinating because I can see in him part of the manifestation of this unbroken tradition. We have no idea how traditions like that are really passed along for thousands and thousands of years, right? Part of it's oral and memory, part of it's acted out and dramatized, and then part of it's going to be imaginative. And people who aren't literate, they store information quite differently than we do. We don't remember anything, it's all written down in books, right? But if you're from an oral culture, especially if you're trained in that way, you have all of that information at hand, both so you can speak it, you can tell the stories, and you really know them. And modern people don't really know what that's like anymore. Doubt if there's more than maybe two of you in the audience that could spout from memory like a 30-line poem. And poetry was written so that people could do that. That's why we have that form, is so that people could remember it and have it with them. And we don't do any of that anymore. Anyways, back to Jung. Jung was a great believer in the dream, and I noted that dreams will tell you things that you don't know. And then I thought, well, how the hell can that be? How that in the world can something you think up tell you something you don't know? How does that make any sense? First of all, why don't you understand it? Why does it have to come forth in the form of the dream? It's like,
So this is a very important notion, or I would say even a premise in this argumentation, and it's that this dreamlike state or the unconscious tells you, gives you information that you don't necessarily have. I'm not too sure that the dreamlike state does this. Uh, I would be interested in seeing, why does he think that a dream tells you something that you don't know? Is it possible to know something and not necessarily be aware that you know it, or to forget something? Uh, so he's giving me like Plato vibes. Plato talked about recollection, like knowledge was just remembering, and that we had this unknown knowledge, which is pretty interesting. That's an interesting connection, as I've said it. But so he really hasn't explained this. How do you know stuff that you don't know? So let's see if he gives any examples of this.
you're not, there's something going on inside you that you don't control, right? The dream happens to you just like life happens to you. I mean, there is the odd lucid dreamer who can, you know, apply a certain amount of conscious control, but most of the time it's you're laying there asleep and this crazy complicated world manifests itself inside you, and you don't know how. You can't do it when you're awake, and you don't know what it means. It's like, what the hell is going on? And that's one of the things that's so damn frightening about the psychoanalysts, because you get this both from Freud and Jung. You really start to understand that there are things inside you that are happening that control you instead of the other way around. There's a bit of reciprocal control, but there's manifestations of spirits, so to speak, inside you that determine the manner in which you walk through life. And you don't control it. And what does? Is it random? There are people who have claimed that dreams are merely the consequence of random neuronal firing, which is a theory I think is absolutely absurd, because there's nothing random about dreams. They're very, very structured and very.
So he just mentioned another premise that he's mentioned if you watch the previous past videos, he's mentioned this in the previous videos. He says that uh, dreams give you knowledge. Dreams give you knowledge that you don't know. I'm not even sure what that means. He hasn't really explained it. And then the second one, he says that he's saying that uh, dreams, there are things in you that control you, and you don't control those things. So there is something, there's something inside of you that controls you. So we'll continue.
Very complex, and they're not like snow on a television screen or static on a radio. Like those things are complicated. And then also I've seen so often that people have very coherent dreams that have a perfect narrative structure. Now they're fully developed in some sense. And so that just doesn't, that theory just doesn't go anywhere with me. I just can't see that as useful at all. And so I'm more likely to take the phenomena seriously, say, well, there's something to dreams. Well, you dream of the future and then you try to make it into a reality. That seems to be an important thing. You know, or maybe you dream up a nightmare and try to make that into a reality, because people do that too if they're hell-bent on revenge, for example, and full of hatred and resentment. I mean, that manifests itself in terrible fantasies. You know, those are dreams, then people go act them out. These things are powerful. You know, and whole nations can get caught up in collective dreams. That's what happened to the Nazis. That's what happened to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. It was absolutely remarkable, amazing.
So it seems like he just confused a dream with an imagination. You know, so he just equivocated, because he's been talking about a dreamlike state that is unconscious. Then he moved into talking about a dreams that you have when you're asleep, and then he mentioned that you can dream up something terrible and try to enact it or realize it in everyday life, which is more like just planning. You know, so he's kind of equivocating his meanings, going back and forth. So he used a dream as in literal sense. He used a dream as the sense of the unconscious, and then he went back and used a dream as like a goal. And so he's equivocating because he's using the same word in different senses to make the same point, which is which isn't a valid approach.
Amazing, horrific, destructive spectacle. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union. The same thing happened in China. It's like we have to take these things seriously, you know, and try to understand what's going on. So Jung believed that the dream could contain more information than was yet articulated. You think artists do the same thing, you know, like people go to museums and they look at paintings, Renaissance paintings or modern paintings, and they don't exactly know why they're there. You know, I was in this room in New York. I don't remember which museum, but it was a room full of Renaissance art, you know, great painters, the greatest painters. And thought maybe that room was worth $1 billion or something outrageous, because there was like 20 paintings in there, you know, so priceless. And the first thing is, well, why are those paintings worth so much? And why is there a museum in the biggest city in the world devoted to them? And why do people from all over the world come and look at them? What the hell are those people doing? One of them was of the Assumption of Mary, you know, beautifully painted, absolutely glowing work of art. And there's like 20 people standing in front of it looking at it and think, what are those people up to? You know, they don't know. Why did they make a pilgrimage to New York to come and look at that painting? It's not like they know. Why is it worth so much? I mean, I know there's a status element to it too, but that begs the question, why do those items become such high status items? What is it about them that's so absolutely remarkable? Well, we're strange creatures. So I was trying to figure out in part, well, where did the information that's in the dream come from? Because it has to come from somewhere, and you could think about it as a revelation, you know, because it's like it springs out of the void and it's new knowledge and it's a revelation. You didn't produce it, it just appears. But that's, see, one of the things I want to do with this series is, like, I'm scientifically minded and I'm quite a rational person, and I like to have an explanation for things that's rational and empirical before I look for any other kind of explanation. And I don't want to say that everything that's associated with divinity can be reduced in some manner to biology or to an evolutionary history or anything like that. But insofar as it's possible to do that reduction, I'm going to do that.
And here we have a very important point about Jordan Peterson's method. He says that what he's going to do is reduce these religious experiences that are associated with God, that are associated with divinity, and so far as he can, he's going to reduce these things to biological constructions, to biological or physiological explanations and their components. And so this is his method. He's assuming a methodological naturalism for his approach. That is assuming that there are natural causes for everything. He's saying that so far as I can do this, this is what I'm going to do because I'm a reasonable person. I'm a scientific thinker. I'm a scientist. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to look for explanations, and these explanations have to be of a certain kind. They have to be natural explanations. Uh, so that's what his approach is going to be. So he one premise is dreams give you knowledge that you don't know. Then a different way of saying it is that there's something inside of you that controls you. This I guess that's like a related point, but this makes it different, but it's still the same source. Then he says, where does this knowledge come from? And he's going to try to explain where this knowledge comes from. But right now, let's get back to the video.
And I'm going to leave the other phenomena floating in the air because they can't be pinned down. And in that category, I would put the category of mystical or religious experience, which we don't understand at all. So artists observe one another. They observe people and they represent what they see, and they transmit the message of what they see to us, and they teach us to see. And we don't necessarily know what it is that we're learning from them. But we're learning something, or at least we're acting like we're learning something. We go to movies, we watch stories, we immerse ourselves in fiction constantly. That's an artistic production. And for many people, the world of the arts is a living world, and that's particularly true if you're a creative person. And it's the creative, artistic people that do move the knowledge of humanity forward, and they do that with their artistic productions first. They're on the edge, and the dancers do that, and the poets do that, and the visual artists do that, and the musicians do that, and we're not sure what they're doing. Like, we're not sure what musicians are doing. What the hell are they doing? Why do you like music? You know, it gives you a deep intimation of the significance of things. And no one questions it. You go to a concert, you're thrilled. It's a quasi-religious experience, particularly if the people really get themselves together and get the crowd moving. You know, there's something incredibly intense about it, but it makes no sense whatsoever. It's not an easy thing to understand. Music is deeply patterned and patterned in layers, and I think that has something to do with it because reality is patterned and deeply patterned in layers. And so I think music is representing reality in some fundamental way, and that we get into the sway of that and sort of participate in being, and that's part of what makes it such an uplifting experience. But we don't really know that's what we're doing. We just go do it, and it's nourishing for people, right? I mean, young people in particular, lots of them live for music. It's where they derive all their meaning, their cultural identity. Everything that's nourishing comes from their affiliation with their music. It is part of their cultural identity. So that's an amazing thing. The question still remains, where does the information in dreams come from? And I think where it comes from is that we watch the patterns that everyone acts out. We've watched that forever, and we've got some representations of those patterns. That's part of our cultural history. That's what's embedded in stories, in fictional accounts of the story between good and evil, the bad guy and the good guy, and the romance. You know, these are canonical patterns of being for people, and they deeply affect us because they represent what it is that we will act out in the world. And then we flesh that out with the individual information we have about ourselves and other people. And so it's like there's waves of behavioral patterns that manifest themselves in the crowd across time. The great dramas are played on the crowd across time. And the artists watch that, and they get intimations of what that is, and they write it down and they tell us, and then we're a little clearer about what we're up to. You know, like a great dramatist like Shakespeare, let's say, we know that what he wrote is fiction, and then we say, well, fiction isn't true. But then you think, well, wait a minute, maybe it's true like numbers are true. You know, numbers are an abstraction from the underlying reality, but no one in their right mind would really think numbers aren't true. You could even make a case that the numbers are more real than the things that they represent, right? Because the abstraction is so insanely powerful. Once you have mathematics, you're just deadly. You can move the world with mathematics. And so it's not obvious that the abstraction is less real than the more concrete reality. And you take a work of fiction like Hamlet and you think, well, is that, it's not true because it's fiction. But then you think, wait a minute, what kind of explanation is that? Like maybe it's more true than nonfiction because it takes what the story that needs to be told about.
So he just answered the question, where does the information in dreams come from? So a crucial premise of Dr. Peterson is that dreams give you knowledge that you don't know. So now he's saying, well, if you don't know it, where does the information comes from? Come from? And he's saying that what artists do is that artists pay attention to patterns of human behavior and they represent that in their art forms, and they give it to us, and then we learn what the way we've been acting, human beings act, and their standards and things like that. And so that's as far as he's gone. So artists watch human actions, they represent those actions in the form of some art, and he's saying that this is what moves humanity forward in our knowledge. But let's see where else he's going with this.
About you and the story that needs to be told about you and you and you and you, and abstracts that out and says, look, here's something that's a key part of the human experience as such, right? So it's an abstraction from this underlying noisy substrate, and people are affected by it because they see that the thing that's represented is part of the pattern of their being. That's the right way to think about it. And then with these old stories, these ancient stories, it seems to me like that process has been occurring for thousands of years. It's like we watched ourselves and we extracted out some stories. We imitated each other and we represented that in drama, and then we distilled the drama and we got a representation of the distillation, and then we did it again. And at the end of that process, it took God only knows how long. I think some of these stories, they've traced fairy tales back 10,000 years, some fairy tales, in relatively unchanged form. And it certainly seems to me that the archaeological evidence, for example, suggests that the really old stories that, that, that the Bible begins with are at least that old and likely embedded in a prehistory that's far older than that. And you might think, well, how can you be so sure? And the answer to that in part is that cultures that don't change, like the ancient cultures, right? They didn't change as fast as this. They stay the same. That's the answer. So they keep their information moving generation to generation. That's how they stay the same. And so we know, again, in the archaeological record, there are records of rituals that have remained relatively unbroken for up to 20,000 years. It was discovered in caves in Japan that were set up for a particular kind of bear worship that was also characteristic of Western Europe. So these things can last for very long periods of time. We're watching each other act in the world. And then the question is, well, how long have we been watching each other? And the answer to that, in some sense, is, well, as long as there's been creatures with nervous systems. And that's a long time, that's some hundreds of millions of years, perhaps longer than that. We've been watching each other, trying to figure out what we're up to across that entire span of time. And some of that knowledge is built right into our bodies, which is why we can dance with each other, for example, right? Because understanding isn't just something that you have as an abstraction. It's something that you act out. That's what children are doing when they're learning to rough and tumble play. Is they're learning to integrate their body with the body of someone else in a harmonious way, learning to cooperate and compete, and that's all instantiated right into their body. It's not abstract knowledge. They don't know that they're doing that. They're just doing it. And so we can even use our body as a representational platform. So we've been studying each other for a long time, abstracting out what is it that we're up to. And that's
So an interesting point that Peterson is making here is that reading the Bible specifically gives you an insight into human nature. Basically, this is what he's saying. He's saying that for millions of years or whatever, thousands of years, however many years he has in mind, people have been imitating one another. So watching one another, and then an artist will watch a group of people. They will depict their actions in some form, whether it's a painting or whether it's a poem, or drama, and then from that drama you start to get patterns, and from the art you start to get patterns, and someone takes the art and begins to represent the art, and then someone takes the representation of the art and represents that, and so on until you get this more and more generalized picture of human nature, uh, by looking at the similarities between across art forms. And I guess this is he's trying to explain why we relate to. Well, I don't know if he's trying to explain this, but it seems like he's doing something like this. Like he's explaining why we relate to characters and stories. Like why are some movies more interesting than other movies? Why are some TV shows more interesting than other TV shows? It's because something about the characters that we can relate to. It's something about the character when the character is a mixture of good and bad that we can relate to. It speaks to us in a way. Uh, and cheesy and corny movies are usually lack the sophistication of our lived experience, and so we're like, man, that's lame. That would never happen, or the characters aren't believable, so on and so on. So maybe he's saying this, and so when he reads scripture, he sees scripture as a insight into human nature that has been cultivated and developed over thousands, over millions of years. And see this, I think this is why people like Jordan Peterson, because he like his this is that's amazing, because when we read the scripture, I think generally Christians believe that when we read the Bible, that the Bible gives us knowledge. I mean, well, I can speak for me personally. Me personally, when I read the scripture or read the Bible, or when I read anything, I like autobiographies. I like to learn about people's lives, because I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to get wisdom about life and the lives of other people, and learning about how to handle certain situations. And he's basically saying that the Bible is a source of knowledge about human nature that spans like the history of our civilization, of our civilized society. And so, and he's making this argument apart from the Bible having being inspired. So that in itself is just amazing and impressive.
That's what is it we're up to? What should we be up to? That's even a more fundamental question. If you're going to live in the world and you're going to do it properly, what does properly mean? And how is it that you might go about that? Well, it's the right question, right? It's what everyone wants to know. How do you live in the world? Not what is the world made of? It's not the same question. How do you live in the world? It's the eternal question of human beings. And I guess we're the only species that has ever really asked that question, because all the other animals, they just go and do whatever they do, not us. It's a question for us. We have to become aware of it. We have to be able to speak it. God only knows why, but that seems to be the situation. So we act, that acting is shaped by the world, that acting is shaped by society into something that we don't understand, but that we can model. We model it in our stories, we model it with our bodies. And that's where the dream gets its information. The dream is part of the process that's watching everything and then trying to formulate it and trying to say, well, trying to get the signal out from the noise and to portray it in dramatic form, because a dream is a little drama. And then you get the chance to talk about what that dream is. And then you have something like articulated knowledge at that point. And so the Bible, I would say, it exists in that space that's half into the dream and half into articulated knowledge. It's something like that. And going into it to find out what the stories are about it can aid our self-understanding. And then the other issue is that if Nietzsche was correct, and if Dostoevsky or Jung was correct, and Dostoevsky as well, without the cornerstone that understanding provides, we're lost. And that's not good, because then we're susceptible to psychic pathology. That's psychological pathology. The people who are adamant anti-religious thinkers seem to believe that if we abandoned our immersement in the underlying dream, that we'd all instantly become rationalists like Descartes or Bacon, or intelligent, clear-thinking, rational, scientific people. And I don't believe that for a moment, because I don't think there's any evidence for it. I think we would become so irrational so rapidly that the weirdest mysteries of Catholicism would seem positively rational by contrast. And I think that's already happening. So, okay. So this is the idea, essentially, that you have the unknown world. That's just what you don't know at all. That's the outside. That's the ocean that surrounds the island that you inhabit, something like that. It's chaos itself. And then you act in that world, and you act in ways you don't understand. There's more to your actions than you can understand. One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it. He said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. When I first, more to your action, you act in.
So I guess when we take a look at this, going back to his central premise that dreams give you knowledge, and he's trying to explain where does the knowledge come from. So he's given us a few more parts to his idea, and it's that human beings imitate other human beings. Some of us are artistic, so we begin to not only imitate but represent this behavior in art, through art. This art then becomes something that is also represented, and we get a broader and broader picture of what human nature is like. What are humans like across time, across cultures? And we do this by looking at different art. Uh, what do people think are funny? People think it's funny, and et cetera, et cetera. So then, from our observations, the dream receives that information, and this is where the dream gets its information from. Now, a question that I would have for Dr. Peterson would be, what is the nature of this dream? He's almost speaking of this dream in terms of it's like he's personifying this dream. Like this dream is getting information, like it's a person. Also, is the unconscious personal? Is it an agent? Is the unconscious a conscious agent that we're not aware of? Is the dream-like state connected between individuals? He doesn't say. He doesn't talk about what the nature of this dream is either. So, but let's continue.
In that world, and you act in ways you don't understand. There's more to your actions than you can understand. One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it. He said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is, because it might be a tragedy, and maybe you don't want it to be. And that's really worth thinking about, because you have a pattern of behavior that characterizes you, and God only knows where you got it. Partly it's biological, partly it's from your parents, it's your unconscious assumptions, it's the way the philosophy of your society has shaped you, and it's aiming you somewhere. Well, is it aiming you somewhere you want to go? That's a good question. That's part of self-realization, We know we don't understand our actions. That's almost every argument you have with someone is about that. It's like, why did you do that? You come up with some half-baked reasons why you did it. You're flailing around in the darkness. You try to give an account for yourself, but you can only do it partially. It's very, very difficult, because you're a complicated animal with the beginnings of an articulated mind, something like that, and you're just way more than you can handle. And all right, so you act things out, right? You act things out. And that's a kind of competence. And then you imagine what you act out, and you imagine what everyone else acts out. And so there's a tremendous amount of information in your action. And then that information is translated up into the dream and into art, into mythology and literature. And there's a tremendous amount of information in that. And then some of that is translated into articulated thought. And I'll give you a quick example of something like that. I think this is partly what happens in Exodus when Moses comes up with the law. You know, he's wandering around with the Israelites forever in the desert, and they're like going left and going right and worshiping idols and like having a hell of a time, and you know, getting rebellious. And Moses goes up in the mountain, and he has this tremendous revelation, sort of in the sight of God, and it illuminates him, and he comes down with the law. You think, well, you know, Moses acted as a judge. I know this is a mythological story. Moses acted as a judge in the desert. He was continually mediating between people who are having problems, constantly trying to keep peace. And so what are you doing when you're trying to keep peace? Is you're trying to understand what peace is, right? You have to apply the principles. Well, what are the principles? Well, you don't know. The principles are whatever satisfies people enough to make peace. And maybe you do that 10,000 times, and then you get some sense of, oh, here's the principles that bring peace. And then one day it blasts into your consciousness like a revelation. Here's the rules that we're already acting out. Well, that's the 10 Commandments. They're there to begin with. And Moses comes forward and says, look, this is already basically.
So this idea here, if you think about what he just said that Moses, I don't know. Moses went to make peace. He's acting as a judge. He says this is a mythological story, which means that it's a representation of how people have acted in different situations over thousands of years, and it's they're representing the imitation in this story. So he doesn't think that the Moses story is historical. He doesn't think Moses is a real person. Apparently, he thinks it's just a myth, you know, like reading about Zeus or whatever. But he thinks that human beings have wrote it, and he's more interested in the human beings that wrote it because, and why the stories appeal, because over time he thinks that they uh, encode knowledge about human nature. So he's saying that Moses doesn't know what the rules for peace is. He says, but well, how have people in the past made peace over time? And so, well, whatever way they made peace, Moses gets this revelation, and aha, this is what we need to do to keep peace and to make peace. So this idea seems to be what Jung believed and called the collective unconscious. It was this idea that everyone had an unconscious part of themselves, and this all of our unconscious selves were connected. And I remember reading Jung and thinking that maybe he thought it was God, that the unconscious was God in some sense, because it was smarter than any human being, any individual human being, and it had knowledge that it wouldn't seem to be unlimited. It would definitely be finite, but uh, definitely it had knowledge that spanned across time. So he's basically using this idea, but he's not saying the name of it. But he's beating around the bush, and so to speak, around the concept of the collective unconscious. And so it's funny how he's using this idea, and it's really, I mean, it's really interesting. It's almost the creativity of him to use this and make these connections is I think is one reason his influence is so widespread. But I don't think it's well argued. He's starting with some assumptions and just arguing from there. I still want to know, what makes you think that there is a collective unconscious? What is the dream like state that you keep repeating? What is that? Is that something you can point to? Is it a thought? Is it the unconscious? Is the unconscious Does the unconscious exist? Or is the unconscious just a name for our lack of knowledge or a lack of awareness? Which are some tough questions, but that he hasn't answered. And since he's not a philosopher, maybe he's not aware of it. But it's not really clear to me.
What we're doing, but now it's codified, right? And like that's all a historical process that's condensed into a single story. But obviously that happened because we have written law, right? And that emerged in good legal systems. That emerges from the bottom up. That's English common law is exactly like that, right? It's single decisions that are predicated on principles that are then articulated and made into the body of law. And the body of law is something you act out. That's why it's a body of law. If you're a good citizen, you act out the body of law. And the body of law has principles. Okay, so the question is, there's principles that guide our behavior. What are those principles? Well, I think if you want the initial answer of what the archaic Israelites meant by God, that's something like what they meant. Now, it's not a good enough explanation, but look, imagine that you're a chimpanzee and you have a powerful, dominant figure at the pinnacle of your society. That represents power. Now, more than that, because it's not sheer physical prowess that keeps a chimp at the top of the hierarchy. It's much more complicated than that. But you could say, well, there's a principle that the dominant person manifests. And then you might say, well, that principle shines forth even more brightly if you know 10 people who are dominant, powerful. Then you can extract out what dominance means from that. You can extract out what power means from that. And then you can divorce the concept from the people. And we had to do that at some point because we can say power in a human context and we can imagine what that means, but it's divorced from any specific manifestation of power. Well, how the hell did we do that? Like, that's so complicated. If you're a chimp, the power is in another chimp. It's not some damn abstraction. Well, so the question is, think about it. We're in these hierarchies, many of them across centuries. We're trying to figure out what the guiding principle is. We're trying to extract out the core of the guiding principle. And we turn that into a representation of a pattern of being. Well, it's something like that. That's God. It's an abstracted ideal. And it's put in personified form. It manifests itself in personified form, but that's okay because what we're trying to get at is in some sense, the essence of what it means to be a properly functioning and properly functioning, properly social, and properly competent individual. We're trying to figure out what that means. You need an embodiment, you need an ideal that's abstracted that you could act out that would enable you to understand what that means. And that's what we've been driving at. So that's the first hypothesis in some sense. I'm going to go over some of the attributes of this abstract.
So here, Dr. Peterson transitions in saying that human beings, we watch different people behave over time. We look at the best actors, the best doers, the most ethical people, and then we abstract from their behavior to a generalized principle of how one should act. And this idea, we also make it personal because we're people and we need a person idea of how a person should act, and this will show us how we should act. And so basically his idea is that this is probably why he has why the lecture is titled Introduction to the Idea of God, so that he has it, his idea of God is something that is built from the ground up like the Tower of Babel. Which is interesting because he's read this passage, even psychologically, what he's saying fits Nimrod better than it does the actual God, because Nimrod thought he could make it to heaven by building up a tower. And to me, that parallels with this idea that human beings can make an idea of God, because what he's overlooking is that people disagree about how they should act and how they should live, and how does that solve this problem? Uh, most people think it's okay to defend their country, to kill to defend their country, but if you're the person being killed, then you probably would have a different opinion of the matter, so these it seems like this idea of God and how people should act shows that uh, it entails that there is much more agreement than what there really is. And when we look at when we look at the world, we see a million different ideas of God. Uh, so this doesn't seem to explain. I mean, a lot of the gods were immoral, and a lot of the They were petty. They would steal. They would manipulate. They would deceive human beings. And you still had to serve them. You still had to please them. So I don't know what this amounts to. Uh, this is a good theory, but I wonder what evidence that he could point to, and it's good in the sense that it's creative. I think it's pretty creative. It's interesting, but I wonder what evidence he can point to justify it.
Ideal that we formalized as God, but that's the first sort of hypothesis, is that a philosophical or moral ideal manifests itself first as a concrete pattern of behavior that's characteristic of a single individual. And then it's a set of individuals. And then it's an abstraction from that set. And then you have the abstraction. It's so important. So here's a political implication, for example. One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God, literally, right? To be deified, to be put in a temple. And you can see why that might happen, because that's someone at the pinnacle of a very steep hierarchy who has a tremendous amount of power and influence. But the Christian response to that was never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else, subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word. So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that, because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law, whatever the body of law, right? There's a principle inside that even the leader is subordinate to. And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society, because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union, and what happened in Maoist China, and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to. You're supposed to be subordinate to God. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to tear that idea apart, but partly what it means is that you're subordinate, even if you're sovereign, to the principle of sovereignty itself. And then the question is, what the hell is the principle of sovereignty? And I could say we have been working that out for a very long period of time. And so that's one of the things that we'll talk about, because the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians had some very interesting, dramatic ideas about that. So, just for example, very briefly, there was a deity known as Marduk. And Marduk, he was a Mesopotamian deity. And imagine this is sort of what happened, is that as an empire grew out of the post-Ice Age, say 15,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, all these tribes came together, and these tribes each had their own deity, their own image of the ideal, but then they started to occupy the same territory, right? And so then one tribe had God A and one tribe had God B, and one could wipe the other one out, and then it would just be God A who wins. But that's not so good, because, well, maybe you want to trade with those people, or maybe you don't want to lose half your population in a war, something like that. So then you have to have an argument about whose God is going to take priority, which ideal is going to take priority. And what seems to happen is that's represented in mythology as a battle of the gods in sort of celestial space. But from a practical perspective, it's more like an ongoing dialogue. You believe this, I believe this. You believe that, I believe this. How are we going to meld that together? So you take God A and you take God B, and maybe what you do is extract God C from them. And you say, well, God C now has the attributes of A and B. And then some other tribes come in, and then C takes them over too. And so you get, like with Marduk, for example, he has a multitude of names, 50 different names. Well, those are names, at least in part, of the subordinate gods that represented the tribes that came together to make the civilization. That's part of the process by which that abstracted ideal is abstracted. You think this is important, and it works because your tribe's alive. And you think this is important, and it works because your tribe is alive. And so we'll take the best of both, if we can manage it, and extract out something that's even more abstract, that covers both of us, if we can do it. And one of the things that's really interesting about Marduk, I'll just give you a couple of his features, but he has eyes all the way around his head. He's elected by all the other gods to be king god. So that's the first thing. That's quite cool. And they elect him because they're facing a terrible threat, sort of like a flood and a monster combined, something like that. And Marduk basically says that if they elect him top god, then he'll go out and stop the flood monster, and they won't all get wiped out. It's a serious threat. It's chaos itself making its comeback. And so all the gods agree. And Marduk is a new manifestation. He's got eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. And then he also goes out, and when he fights this deity called Tiamat. And we need to know that because the word Tiamat is associated with the word Tehom, Tehom. And Tehom is the chaos that God makes order out of at the beginning of time in Genesis. So it's linked very tightly to this story. And Marduk, with his eyes and his capacity to speak magic words, goes out to confront Tiamat, who's like a watery sea dragon, something like that. It's a classic St. George story. To go out and wreak havoc on the dragon. And he cuts her into.
So this wraps up the idea. We From this section, I think we've put together something of his method. Dr. Peterson wants to ground his explanations of the knowledge that comes from dreams and the biological evolution of human beings over millions of years. And this is his what he says. Uh, it's interesting because what he thinks is that people imitate one another. Artists represent those imitations, those actions in some art form that then the art is represented over and over again until we see to their generalized uh, archetypes and patterns and characters that keep popping up in different stories, and that even God itself was something that came from an individual's behavior who acted in a way that a group uh, aspired to or liked or appreciated, uh, which is really different from morality because just because you imitate something doesn't mean that it's good to do. And so I would be interested in his moral ontology. What does he think good is? Is good just what we like? Is good just what feels good to us? Because we know we have examples of the falsity of that in everyday experience. I mean, the things that are the best for to us are the things that kill us the quickest. Uh, Sweet. I have a sweet tooth. I love sugar, but sugar gives you cavities if you don't brush your teeth, and then uh, eating sweets makes you fat, and that fat causes diseases, and healthy food doesn't always taste the best. So if what good is just what we like, then that's not morality. He's equivocating on morality and on religious. So also his whole theory is based on the assumption that God has not revealed himself to, to humanity. So he's reading scripture while rejecting the essential claim of scripture that it is the word of God. Uh and he reads it from a naturalistic lens. He's not interested in scripture to learn about how God has revealed himself in history. He's interested in seeing how people have developed their beliefs about God and about how one should behave and through imitation over a long period of time. So although this seemed before I started this series, this seemed to be something that was, Dr. Jordan Peterson, he's studying the Bible and he's doing talks on the Bible. Yay, hooray, you like the Bible, great. I mean, his talk is the most anti Christian, anti, I mean, anything. If you're a religious person, it's anti everything. You believe in God and you believe that God has spoken, that God has revealed himself in history, then this is talk is just completely against uh everything we believe the scripture to be. Is it just a book written by people over a long period of time? And that's the way he reads it, and he just thinks it's interesting because he sees it as a edited book that's been edited in some sense millions of years. Why does Let me ask him this: why does he believe in a collective unconscious? Why does he believe in the dreamlike state? Uh, because we do things we can't control. Therefore, there's something controlling us. Like, does that doesn't even follow? Has he observed the thing that he says is controlling him? I doubt it. So now he's not even using his empirical method of analysis to to establish the most essential concepts and constructs within his own theory, and that's the dreamlike state. Can he Has he observed this dreamlike state? Can he see it in a microscope? Can he see it in a test tube? Can he cut it? Can he smell it? Can he taste it? No. So he's not. He hasn't observed this dreamlike state yet. He says that we have knowledge from this dreamlike state. He hasn't observed this dreamlike state yet. He says that this dreamlike state uh, gets information from our observations of other human beings. Has he observed that? So it's like he has posited a God of his own creation, a God that he has received from his leaders, which is Jung and Freud, psychologists, who posited that there was an unconscious. But does the unconscious is an unconscious an actual ontological entity? Does it actually exist, or is it just a description of what we are not aware of? So it's a negative concept, meaning that it has no content. Like I said, the cup is empty. I'm not saying that there's something called empty that is in this cup. Uh, I'm saying that there is not something in the cup. So it's the absence of something. It's not the presence of something. And if he talks about the unconscious, can he establish that empirically? Well, if not, then what? Why in the world believe in it? I mean, we can empiricism, methodological naturalism goes a long way. Goes a long way. I mean, and it's an inconsistent methodology and epistemology. Uh, so thanks for joining us. We're going to pick up next time to get into this, and would like to finish this video just to critique his idea of God. Uh, Now that I see where he's coming from, it's kind of like, oh, it's not as pro, yay, we got a hero in Jordan Peterson, as I thought, or as I think a lot of Christians would believe if we really, I mean, if you really listened to what he had to say and thought about it, reflected on it. Uh Introduction to the idea of God. He's trying to explain where the origin of this idea came from. It came from imitation. We imitated one another, the things that we liked, and eventually said, "Yeah, this is good." So we abstracted those behaviors and created a person that did those behaviors that we liked. And I guess we gave him more and more abilities over time, is what he wants to say. That tribes conquered other tribes and absorbed their guides and absorbed the abilities. Uh, but that, that doesn't. How does that explain where the information in his dreamlike state came from? Maybe he's going to get into this. So next time, I guess we'll take a look at it. But thank you for joining. Thank you for spending your evening with me. Now, my name is Sean Mixon. I am Thought Decoder. And as always, remember to think better. Like, share, subscribe. Hope you enjoy this. Leave a comment. Let me know what you like, what you didn't like, and it will help me to grow and better serve you. Thank you so much. You have a great evening.